Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you who are joining us from other parts of the world. Again, my name is Paul Cheung. I'm at the Knight Foundation. Today, we have two fantastic speakers that we're going to go deep into the nuances of misinformation and disinformation. We have Laura Lindenfeld. She's the Executive Director of the Allen Ada Center for Communicating Science. She's also the Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism and the Vice Provost of the Academic Strategy and Planning at Stony Brook University. And that's in New York, for those who are not familiar with New York. Second, we have Alan Miller. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and the founder and CEO of the News Literacy Project, a national education nonprofit that works with educators and journalists to offer resources and tools to help middle school and high school students learn to separate facts from fiction. Prior to the News Literacy Project, Alan has spent 21 years at the Los Angeles Times. Good afternoon, Alan and Laura. How are you guys doing?
Doing well, Paul. Good afternoon.
Well, before we go, the joy of Zoom. Before we go deep into some of the key questions, Alan, I was hoping that you could actually do some grounding of what is misinformation and disinformation? What is the definition of it?
So hello, everybody, and thank you to the Bulletin for sponsoring this timely event. The key here is intent. Misinformation covers a wide array of false content. It could be rumors, it could be memes, content that's out of context, could be satire, and it's passed along for a variety of reasons. It may be that people actually believe it. They may be passing along for clickbait, to get likes and shares. It may be that they actually think they're benefiting somebody by sharing it. Disinformation, in contrast, is information that is knowingly created to be deceptive. And it is the kind of information that we see in some cases being created by foreign governments or intelligence agencies with a specific purpose in mind, whether it's to influence behavior or to undermine trust in democratic institutions. And so that's the key difference.
Laura, has misinformation and disinformation been around for a while, or is this something really recent?
So let me differentiate between the terms themselves and what they represent. As long as we've been communicating, we've been mis and disinforming. What I know about the term misinformation is that it's been around since people estimate somewhere between 1350 and 1400 as a term. And disinformation, also what I've learned is that it comes originally out of the Russian and then into French and then into English, somewhere in the mid to late 1960s. But the practice of mis and disinforming, I think, is as old as possibly humanity itself.
And is one form worse than the other?
Oh, they can both be bad. I mean, they're part of this. Disinformation, to me, is a subset of misinformation, which can have terrible consequences. The potential evil intent, of course, can accelerate investment into a disinformation campaign. I don't know, Alan, what do you think? I think they both have potential horrible consequences.
I think one big difference is most of us are not creating disinformation. We're certainly not doing it knowingly to deceive whether friends, families, others in the online community. However, we are all prey in some ways in this incredibly fraught information landscape to both mis and disinformation, and much more inclined, I think, to share it unwittingly if we're not really mindful about what we're looking at, who created it, for what purpose, and is this something that I really should trust and share and act on? And those are key questions and habits of mind that we try to instill in both the next generation and all generations.
So if mis and disinformation been around for a while, what is different about this time around? Why do you think, with all the talks about misinformation, disinformation being a grave threat to democracy, it's been around for centuries and we still have a vibrant democracy. Is it different this time?
Maybe, how about I start off with a thought about culture and technology. So on the one hand, you've got technology. I was thinking about, when the printing press was invented, huge technological change, literacy rates went up and you could miss or even disinform, which requires some strategy, and information could spread. But now it spreads so rapidly through social media channels. Alan, I know you're very conversant in talking about how there's sources with no gatekeeping where information just goes out. You can't even trace where it's from. So I think the ability to miss or disinform has been accelerated and exacerbated by technology, but it's also become part and parcel of our culture.
Well, there's no barrier to entry, right? Anybody now can essentially be a publisher. And there's a lot of incentive for people to create mis and disinformation, whether it's for a profit motive or ideologically or partisan, or to get more followers on social media. The social media platforms are kind of set up to be engagement through enragement. They reward things that are polarizing and that are extreme and that provoke emotion. And we are much more vulnerable to this when things engage us emotionally, whether they make us angry or anxious or even happy. The thinking part of our brain tends to shut down and we have a more visceral reaction. The other thing is that, we have an environment now where people can look for those things that confirm their pre-existing beliefs as opposed to things that challenge them. And so the algorithms themselves intensify that experience, and then people bring their confirmation bias, and it makes for both greater vulnerability to mis and disinformation, and it also further intensifies kind of the hyper-partisan age in which we live. And the result is that particularly in the past year, between the pandemic and the election and the post-election, is that we've just seen this huge wave of conspiratorial thinking that's moved from sort of the fever swamps of the web, onto the streets and into the Capitol and the halls of Congress. And I think this has now become really one of the great existential challenges of our time.
Yeah, no doubt. At Night, we've been really focusing on how to mitigate misinformation, but who's at fault here? Is the principal, is Facebook and the technology company really the one at fault? Who are these so-called bad actors, right? Is it the tech platform? Is it politician? Is it our grandmothers, right? Because we also know from research that unfortunately, a lot of moms and grandmas share a lot of misinformation, disinformation on social platform. Like, who's really at fault here?
There's no one entity here that necessarily is responsible, just as there's no simple panacea here to alleviate the challenge. Fundamentally, as Laura was saying, the internet and digital technology have so radically changed the way that we communicate with each other and the way that we engage in our civic life. That's the fundamental change. The social media platforms, as I mentioned, are set up to maximize that engagement and have been, I think, slow and late to responding to the need to limit or eliminate extreme posts and that encourage hate and violence and undermine democracy and public health. Obviously, the bad actors are out there, whether governments or individuals. And we obviously know all about the Russian campaign in 2016 and their continued efforts. It's not just Russia, it's China and many other countries as well. And then individuals who are creating misleading and false content. But the other thing I would mention is we all bear some responsibility, because the most damaging posts can't get the kind of virality that they get without so many of us, mostly unwittingly, sharing them with others. And that's where we need to take a sense of personal responsibility and become part of an information solution instead of the misinformation problem.
Alan, I agree so wholeheartedly. I was reflecting on this question. When you're getting ready to do a conversation like this, you think about this a lot. And I find myself, on the one hand, yes, there are some people who need to be held accountable for their behavior. Most of this, I want to ask the question of how do we take responsibility as individuals, as organizations to combat this, especially if it's become part of our, McLuhan, the medium is the message, it's part of our culture, and the medium itself is driving different messages at a different speed. And that in turn becomes part of the way that we get up and we live. And how many of us didn't look at some social media in the last 24 hours or get texts about information or look at something fleetingly? So the question to me, that not that it's not important to hold people accountable who are deliberately spreading disinformation, but when we participate, someone can disinform us and then we can participate in misinforming without intentionally wanting to spread false information. So it's a really complex set of cultural questions intertwined with our use of and advancement of technology.
I mean, to me, it seems like this is a system-wide issue, right? So you're talking about a infodemic that is affecting all sectors. So Alan, for your project in particular, what do you learn from teaching sort of like middle school students and high school students about information, sort of like news literacy? Like, what do you learn from them that could be applicable for scientists and adults?
So I started the News Literacy Project 13 years ago and helped launch the field of news literacy with the support of the Knight Foundation. And particularly in our early years when we were doing a classroom program before we moved to a digital online platform called Checkology, spent a lot of time in classrooms, in middle and high school classrooms. And one of the things I saw is, and the research supports this, is how this generation may be digital natives, they are woefully ill-equipped to navigate this fraught information landscape. And they may be getting news and credible information, where they're getting most things on their devices, but they don't necessarily recognize it as news, and they don't seek it out unless they learn what it represents and why it's more credible. Often what we've seen is that students believe all information is created equal, that maybe if the younger students think that if it's online, it must be true, that somebody must have verified it. And by the time they're in high school, some students are already rather cynical and think that it's all equally driven by bias, whether it's commercial bias or political bias or institutional bias. They already may be deep into their own filter bubbles where they're looking for, again, information that confirms their existing beliefs instead of challenge them. So, one of the things we've seen is that when they learn how to discern credible information and get an appreciation of the role of a free press and the First Amendment and democracy, it is incredibly empowering. I mean, it's really transformative for how they're evaluating what to trust and what to share and what to act on. And we believe this is why this is an essential life skill in this information age.
And Laura, for sort of in your area expertise, what are you seeing as Alan is working with sort of the middle to high schools, for college students and some of the academics? Like, are you seeing that they also get duped by misinformation, disinformation? Because you assume college educated folks will be able to discern what is truth and not.
I mean, what's so challenging about disinformation campaigns is that we can all fall prey to them, and we have to be really vigilant about what we believe and what we communicate. And miscommunication is part of being human. Anybody out there married who's ever miscommunicated? Even though I told my son this morning 5 times to put the wheelbarrow away and fill up my car with gas, it didn't happen. Clearly the fault is mine for not communicating clearly enough. So part of it's human and part of it is the plethora of information coming at us and being able to filter it. And I'll add to what Alan's saying, the kind of tribalism we have in our media consumption, it drives us back into groups. So we tend to be in echo chambers with people who believe things that we do. So I actually see this from a couple different levels. I have too many titles for any person, but I see it from the university level where, how do you as an institution combat misinformation about your institution, whether it's the science or the research that's being produced there or things people are saying about the education at your institution? That's a systemic level question. And then I see it in the communication and journalism school and what we need to do, not only to prepare college students, whether they're undergraduate or graduate, to tell the difference, but also to be able to, and I love this so much about the students we work with, they have ideas about where we can go to counter mis and disinformation that I don't know. I wouldn't think of pushing news onto TikTok because I'm not on there, but apparently that's where a lot of people who are much younger than I am are, and they're getting information. And then, in terms of the work that Alan's doing, reaching out and getting younger students engaged at earlier points so that they can at least take a pause, think critically, and know not everything I get is truth, and I hold some responsibility.
Yeah, we have a very robust chat. Thank you for everyone sort of like really chiming in. Alan and Laura, when we think about sort of the current climate of mis and disinformation, so much of the, I don't know, will you say it's a perception that misinformation is heavier from left, from the conservative versus the liberals, right? Does misinformation, disinformation, especially in the US, take a polarization bent?
So I would start by saying that when people, and this is very common across the spectrum, look at media through prisms of red and blue, that's when they tend to see the world in terms that are much more black and white. And I think you see that in terms of the lower trust in media in general, but then it's bifurcated by people more conservatives trusting certain media and more liberal others. Obviously, we've seen an enormous amount of misinformation and disinformation associated with the pandemic and with the election. And there is clearly an effort that is coming from, obviously, the former president and others to undermine faith in what was a free and fair election, and to provoke action on that front, which we see happening, we saw on January 6th, and we see happening in state capitals around the country as well. At the same time, this is not unique to conservatives. You can see in the anti-vaxxer movement, for instance, cutting across ideological lines. And you can see issues surrounding the pandemic as well that are not unique. So I think this is a challenge across the board, and it is a challenge for all generations. In fact, we've created resources now for the general population as well, because we think that this is a threat to democracy that really can't wait, in terms of the next generation being, the majority of our voters and citizens.
So one more media question before I turn to Laura about what scientists can do. Alan, what is media? How could media be accountable for this, right? Because I saw in the chat, folks using, if it bleeds, it leads. That's very much a local television driver. So when we think about, what is media's role? And there's a lot of critique about sort of what's going on, especially around cable and TV news. Would you say that's particularly true with the broadcast sector, or would you say, newspaper as well as digital also play a role in proliferating mis and disinformation?
So first of all, I would be careful about using the term media, because if we step back and think about what that represents, we're talking about a huge swath of what's called the mainstream legacy media. We've got media that is clearly partisan, left and right. You've got online media, individuals, bloggers who are creating things. So we need to be careful about generalizing. And I think often people bring to that term their own sort of perspective on their view of news media and what they consume. I think in terms of the media's role, and I was a journalist, as you noted, Paul, for 29 years, it's really critical to double down on the standards of quality journalism. So verification, documentation, fairness, accountability, transparency in terms of sources and methods, acknowledging what you know and what you don't know, correcting mistakes, factual mistakes. And anyone you follow, any organization you follow, I would look for that as a key element. And then, separating news and opinion, or clearly delineating news, analysis, opinion, is really critical. And I think this is one of the places where it becomes more challenging with the cable networks that people watch so much, because you've got a real blending there of news and sometimes very hardline opinion. And then you've got panels that include journalists and commentators and partisans. And I think this makes it more difficult for the public to sort out what to trust and what they're looking at, which is, again, one reason it's so key to teach foundationally the difference between news, opinion, advertising, propaganda, so that people understand those primary purposes and what those standards are.
Yeah, I mean, I believe one of the major challenges, when you're talking about even a decade ago, your news sources was finite, where now is almost infinite, right? So I think part of it is the system is also overwhelmed with too much sources, right? Like, I don't think the problem we have right now is not enough news, is sort of like how the news is getting contextualized. Laura, question for you, especially for this community, science has been under attack for the past several years. What can scientists do what role should scientists and researchers play in this battle?
I'm so glad you asked about that. So one of the hats I wear is directing the Alda Center for Communicating Science, which is what drew me back to Stony Brook. I'm from Long Island, New York originally, and it drew me back here. And I'm so thrilled to oversee this organization whose mission is to help advance more effective science communication. And one of the key things that we do is train scientists to communicate. And for anybody who knows Alda, he's an actor and he's a very spontaneous one. And our whole approach is grounded in improvisational theater. And the point of that is to help people be able to connect and relate and build trust. Trust is so key to this, because what we're talking about is building strong enough relationships that people will listen to different voices than the ones that may be in the current echo chamber they're in. I love this idea that we are not thinking beings who also happen to feel. We are feeling beings who also happen to think. And if we want to appeal to people's sense of reason, we've got to take the idea that you come with a heart and a head together and you live your lives in communities who have values and histories and culture. We've got to take that seriously if we're going to break through disparate belief systems. So you asked me about scientists and what we can do. I think, we can certainly help scientists to go out in media and communicate better. I'm really excited about a post-COVID era where we can be in person more and start to rebuild some relationships that may have gotten even more broken through the pandemic, where people were more and more isolated. And I think that helped churn up even more disbelief. I'll say, and then I'm going to pause for a sec because I'm putting a lot in here at once. If you look at the way the United States public thinks about science, levels of trust in science as an institution have been fairly consistent. There's really nice research from Pew and other organizations. Within that, it breaks down into subgroups. People on the right tend to trust certain types of science produced by certain institutions more than others, and same on the left. So science gets politicized. I'd like to see us take science more and more, it's impossible to do it completely, out of the political context and understand the process of it, how it works. Alan, very much how you and other people in news literacy teach students to filter through fact and fiction, understanding how the process of science itself works and bringing a healthy level of scrutiny to science. That's what science does for itself, I think is healthy as part of democratic debate and thinking. Let me pause there.
So the question here is, for Alan and Laura, both news and science were, was once viewed as sort of, the definitive truth. But when that itself is being challenged, and when everything is so politicized, is there any hope? Like, do you think people could actually separate when people get to choose what facts they choose to believe or what science is legit?
I mean, in a democracy, people get to choose what they want to believe. I think we've got, what we're invested in is helping scientists come to the table and be more engaged with society so that we don't think of science here and society there. And as we are able to build more dynamic relationships that are engaging, where the scientific community is listening. I mean, there's science and there's decisions. I love the idea that science informs decision making, but other factors weigh into decision making as well. Alan, do you want to jump in here? I could talk about this forever. I want to make sure it's a dialogue where you're bringing your perspective to this as well. What do you think about this question? Acceptance of science, democracy, debate?
Well, look, I think it's imperative that we preserve, a fact-based civic life. I mean, facts are the basis for what we teach in our schools. They're the basis for our scientific exploration and findings. They're the basic for our most effective public policy debates and outcomes. And I think if they are in trouble, I think democracy is really in trouble. And I mean, there are verifiable, evidence-based, facts. And the key is for people to be looking for them and looking for them presented in a way that is contextual and intended to inform. And through the news media in hopefully in a dispassionate and accurate and fair way. So I think that's really the critical issue here. The news media and science, they are imperfect, both by nature, but if done well and presented in a transparent way, where people can see what the evidence is, what the basis is for the findings, and then make up their mind. I think that is the best way to be persuasive, give people actionable information.
I have one more question before we open up to audience Q&A. So Laura, you talk about engagement, right? And I find that to be really interesting as sort of a concept, because we know that you could give all the facts in the world, and fact checking only work when you're already in sort of that bubble. So when you talk about sort of engagement, what type of engagement are you talking about? And why do you think engagement is an effective tactic?
This is a really thoughtful question, Paul. So I think, we're talking here about a systemic problem or a series of systemic problems. These are not all the same. Not every single piece of mis or disinformation can be combated or dealt with in the same way. So it really depends on what is the issue, who is the audience, what do the people whose lives or livelihoods or whatever is at stake care about, and then what's the strategy for how to reach them. So the engagement itself, it may really depend. A lot of what I care about is helping scientists whose work needs to be shared. And I'll tell you, I saw a comment in here, science are introverts. Not necessarily true. And some are really fabulous communicators. There's really different ways of engaging. And I believe the time has come for us to explore more partnerships with thought leaders who are trusted in and by communities who may not otherwise want to listen or care to listen. Maybe because they have not felt like science has helped them. So I think engagement could be forming bridges. It could be media outputs. It could be working in schools. It really depends on the issue at hand and the community and the level of risk at stake for those involved.
Will you say that's true, Alan? Engagement is more effective than just fact checking and throwing people with more facts?
Yes, and I think it's really critically important that engagement come from a diverse array of voices, whether we're talking about the media and who is doing the reporting and editing and making decisions on coverage, the stories that are chosen, the sources who are represented in those stories. And I think we've seen this in terms of the vaccine effort. To find respected voices in different communities to overcome, for instance, obviously been a challenge in Black communities to get more people vaccinated and to have leaders in whether it's in sports or in public life to be engaged. I think that's critically important, and we've seen the growth in news media as well of local particularly nonprofit organizations that are led by people of color communicating in those communities. And I think that's important too.
So I want to open up for audience Q&A. Hallie, do you have some instructions?
Yes, thanks, Paul. Hello again. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner and I'm the program manager here at the Bulletin. We do ask that you please keep yourself on mute throughout the program unless you're called on for a question. If you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please use the raise hand function. Our moderator will see that. You can find this by clicking on the participants button or the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. Please do not physically raise your hand as there are too many participants on this call for us to recognize you that way. A recording of this program is going to be available on our website in the coming days. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you. And please introduce yourself. And if you have a question that's direct to either Alan, Laura, or me, just say so. Anyone? Paul S.
Yes.
You're mute.
I'm a retired engineer and I'm proud of it. 40 years and I have a master's degree from Stanford and worked at Bell Labs and a number of very good places. And one thing I noticed was during the last administration, there was a basic attack on, I would say, reality itself. One of the spokespersons for the past administration, I'm not going to get heavily into politics, but said, there are no more facts. There are only ratings. And when you get into that level of disbelief, unacceptance of reality, that's a very difficult thing to deal with. Any comment on that?
It is very difficult. I'm going to tell you a story about Alan Alda. He has this wonderful book called Never Get Your Dog Stuffed, where he talks about his mom who had paranoid events. And just read this book. I don't know if any of you have anybody read it. And he goes into the room where she's at. She says, there's a demon in the room. And the tenets of improv teach you to say yes and to make your audience look good. That's the concept. Now, I'm not saying you do that with trolls, but in this situation, he said, yes, mom, and I'm here to help you. And he was able to help her move through this and build enough trust that she could listen. Otherwise, he would have alienated her further. So, again, there's no simple solution to a really complex problem, but I feel like if we don't try to build some bridges and create meaningful, trusting relationships, people are not going to listen. If we just yell at them and point a finger and say, you're stupid and you're wrong, I feel like in many situations, not in all, in many situations, bringing a dose of humility and genuine listening and care for each other can help us overcome some of these challenges. Not all.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I mean, so much of it is just about being human, right? Being respectful, which is what I'm hearing a lot, especially in communities of color. Mario, you're next. You're on mute.
Wait a second. Hello, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to our home and make us a little bit less ignorant. Beautiful baby, Hillary. Thank you very much for showing your baby. Now, You know what? I'm really sorry to take your innocence away right here, right now. But let me tell you, the misinformation bandwagon, runaway train starts right here, right with us, because with every little move we make into social media, we're being steadily but slowly and surely, and that's something I discuss in my upcoming book, herded into our little ideological pens. And it's very hard to get away from those. And that's why we have so many prejudice, we have so many assumed truths, etc., etc. So, you know what? We have to first understand that the way communication is being set up now, we have to be very careful what we do. Even doctrine our picture for social media in order to get a nice date, and that's something that I don't do because I gave a woman a long time ago. But you know what? We have to understand that it starts right here, okay? And we're also culprits of this horrible situation we have. And that's why we have a remake of 1984. Every time we open our web pages and we see Yahoo, okay, we're giving a certain version of the truth. It's like when the central character in 1984 watched the TV.
Oh, thank you, Mario. Were there a particular question that you have? Okay, no, thank you. Hillary, you're next. So again, it would be great if you could, start with your question first and then with your commentary or opinion after, so that at least for Alan and Laura, they would know how to answer your questions. Hillary, you're next, and you're from France?
Yes, I'm in France. Hi, I'm with Philippe. Hopefully he'll let me ask my question. Alan, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this. And I like tangible specifics. So my question would be, how could science and the media better communicate about something like climate change? With an example being, I think a lot about situations like in North Carolina, where the government was given a report that said the sea levels are going to rise by 6 feet. And, the legislation got together and voted and said, no, it's actually only going to be 3 feet, which was insane because they were voting on science. But my point being, I think North Carolina depends so heavily on tourism as an industry for the economy. And it felt like there was a disconnect between what the scientists were saying and what was actually going to be feasible and resonate with the government and residents of North Carolina. Just as a very specific case in point, is that an example of how misinformation could be addressed through science so that politicians themselves aren't spreading misinformation? Thank you.
So I'll let Laura handle the science piece. The thing I would say in general on climate change, and we've seen an evolution here over time, but early on, I think that the news media tended to engage in a kind of false balance, and that early on there was a lot of reporting that there was a debate about climate change and for whether it was real and whether it was man-made, and there was a slowness to recognize that even though there were a minority perhaps of scientists, and certainly there were political actors and industry that were disputing this, that the overall preponderance of science said that the climate was in fact changing and warming, and that there were man-made significant contributions to that. So I would say, and I think the media has gotten much better about that, and I think that that's kind of a case study of avoiding the kind of sort of two-sidesism when there's such a preponderance of evidence on one side.
I'll just jump in there really quickly. I just posted in the chat. There's just some really elegant social science research that's been done on perceptions of climate. And I posted from the Yale program on climate change communication, the 6 Americas, and they track over time different audience segments' perception of climate. So my quick response to this really complex answer is engagement's important, the proper kind of engagement's important. The scientists who are doing the engagement should be trained so they understand the differences in audience and can create connections rather than further alienate people. Very, very challenging situation and question.
Yeah, Knight also recently funded Sideline, which is a independent nonpartisan nonprofit service for journalists and scientists. And the goal is to get more scientists to be sources for media so that when there is an issue, then they don't have to scramble to figure out who's a legit source. So I'm gonna jump around because I just wanna make sure that we're equitable in terms of who's asking the questions and have a balance of gender and diversity. So I'm gonna go to Peter next and then followed by Mary before I go back to Bill. So Peter, you're next. You're on mute, Peter.
Yeah, okay, I'm unmuted and thank you for that. I'm Peter Lindenfeld and I don't know whether I'm related to Laura, but we're starting to explore that. I was interested in her comments on science, and we often talk about the fact that people don't listen enough to scientists. I think it's the other way around that's important also, that scientists have removed themselves and made themselves such a special priesthood that they no longer are in contact with the public. And that thought was echoed by Rush Holt, who was until recently the CEO of the largest science organization in the world, when he said that scientists have become so remote from the public, have removed themselves and made what they say so complicated that their voice is not always heard. And I think we have to work on both sides of that equation. And I would be interested in hearing Laura's comments on that.
Well, first of all, I love meeting another Lindenfeld. You think it's a common name and it's not. So thank you for contacting me. I can't wait to follow up. I have a feeling we're connected somewhere. And also, I love your question. A big part of what we do is try to mobilize and incentivize scientists to listen and hear. If we're not engaged as citizens in society and trying to understand what people care about, we're not gonna reach across an unfortunate divide. So a big part of the improvisational exercises and training that we do are about creating genuine connection and listening and hearing.
Mary, you're up next. Mary Honus, you have your hand up. Going once, going twice.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so my question is, we have a lot of rating systems here in the United States, and it's my understanding that we have like 6 corporations that own most of the media stations, you know, Fox News and ABC, NBC, and all those, but they're not rated for facts. And I'm not quite sure why, if we have videos and we have music that's all rated, so that tells people that are buying into it, if they're how they're rated for various things, why we can't do the same thing with media and let people know how factual they really are.
Alan, that sounds like a good question for you.
Well, there is an organization actually that's seeking to do this called NewsGuard that basically rates credibility of outlets. I think this is a very challenging thing to do across the board because, as I mentioned earlier, most news organizations are a mix of news and opinion and analysis. So in terms of what it is you rate, and the truth is, journalism by its nature is imperfect in practice. I mean, it's called the first rough draft of history for a reason, and bias will creep in. Journalists will make mistakes, not that they make things up, but inadvertently for various reasons, and so much of what people get now, particularly younger people, is disaggregated in any case. They're getting it through their social media feeds. They're not necessarily going to a site. So this is why, we don't tell people, the News Literacy Project, what to trust and what not to trust. And we don't steer them to any particular outlet or away from any outlet. Rather, we give them the critical thinking skills to make those judgments for themselves, with whatever they encounter and wherever they encounter it, because consumers in charge now of what they see and where they see it and when, and most important, what they do with it. News is only one part of this really challenging information ecosystem. So much else is being communicated through other means, as we talked about, through social media and through bloggers. And so, that's why really It's that habit of mind, going back to what we've been talking about, personal responsibility. And I'll go back to Paul's question earlier. I mean, I believe that, we saw in 4 years, we went from alternative facts to kind of alternative realities. And with the rise of QAnon and conspiracy theories around the pandemic and the election, I think we need a new ethos of personal responsibility, where people, take responsibility for what they consume and they share, and they say false information or false content stops with me. And we see a sea change along the lines we've seen around issues like smoking and drunk driving and littering, where we collectively, as a society, decide to become part of the information solution instead of the misinformation problem. And I think that that's got to be a critical part of any effort to push back against this rising toxic tide of misinformation.
Yeah, and Mary, I would say in terms of ratings, we just have to be really careful, right? Because it could have both positive and negative consequences, right? Because who's going to be the one doing the ratings? The public, politician, government. If anyone is following what's going on in Hong Kong, the Apple Daily News, just got shut down by the Hong Kong government. So it's one of the last pro-democracy newspaper because, they cite, the government is citing that they are in fact, inciting riots and all these other stuff. So, ratings is both and good depending how you see it. And I think it get really tricky in journalism. Christopher, you're next. I really appreciate your Japanese animation background. You're on mute.
Thank you. I'm a practicing physicist. I'm living in Germany. My question is about the nature of democracy and how the polemic style of debate really bleeds across into public debate. And do you see this as inevitable that people will stop thinking about what the actual issues, for example, environment are, and sort of think more on a partisan basis? So that's a question for both you, Alan and Laura.
I'm sorry, Laura.
I want to make sure I heard. Can you
repeat Christopher?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand the question.
So, people will, if a debate starts, it's usually on the basis of your political persuasion, usually. And this is a lens that people look at the person that's speaking and immediately distrust them. And, this is, I think, an innate in the democratic process, that people are starting to think about the politics rather than the issue that affects them. Does that make it sense at all?
Does it what? Does it?
That in a polemic debate, it's about the other person. You're arguing against the other person, and so it becomes a character assassination, if you like.
Yeah.
The other person is wrong, and this is the nature of the political process in most countries, as far as I can see, and this tends to bleed across into debates about very important issues. And I'm particularly passionate about the environment, and for example, from my perspective, the Green Movement has done some terrible disservices to the environment. And if you try to have that debate, it's not something that is a very easy thing to have with anybody. That's a very good example of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Christopher. So I think what I'm hearing, Laura and Alan, is basically a polarization, right? With certain topics that had gotten so polarized that we can't even allow ourselves to have that conversation. Whether it is, climate change or gun control.
So is the question what to do about it? Because I agree. I mean, it always concerns me when something that's fact-based becomes politicized, because then you almost forcefully alienate someone from those facts if they want to align with their culture and the groups they belong to. What to do about it? Boy, that's a big question. I know that trust is absolutely essential to overcoming some of these are insurmountably challenging. There's not a simple story to flip it. I keep coming back to the idea that better relationships can help us overcome some of this. Better relationships, really strategic thought, communication in the right way to the right people about the right things. I mean, I have family members who sit on various ends of the political spectrum, and it's actually amazing to me that everybody's become vaccinated, because I wasn't sure I would see that. So there's something coming through where people said, I'm going to make this choice to get this vaccine, and I trust that it's going to be okay. I'm not exactly sure how that came to be. I didn't expect that.
Yeah, I think some of it is just, because we sort of focus on facts on either side rather than the impact, because I think there's certain things that we agree on, right? We agree that, children shouldn't die from random gun violence, right? We should agree on that people shouldn't die from COVID if there's something that could save them. But I just think, to Christopher, some of your question is, I think so much of the focus and polarization is on who's right and wrong rather than what is our basis of agreement as a community. And then somehow we sort of like, it's almost like when a couple's like argue, you go to therapy, like focus on what you agree on and then like work out the disagreement. I think a lot of times right now, what we don't do is we don't focus on what we could even agree on. We sort of focus on who's right and wrong. So Bill, your hand's been up several times, so you're next. And please, I want to get, with 5 minutes, I want to get as much questions as we can. So what I'm going to do is Bill, Henry, and James, I'm going to have you guys ask your question, and then Laura and Alan to synthesize before we go into a wrap. So Bill, your quick question.
Quick question, thanks, Paul. Yes, my name's Bill Garakis, and I'm a retired science lecturer based in Cambridge, UK. Just to make a general personal assessment or opinion about our discussion, and to say that already we've made the point that misinformation and deception campaigns have been going on throughout history, and they can be very effective and they can be very beneficial sometimes, as well as very detrimental. For instance, I'm thinking of the very successful and very sophisticated deception campaigns in World War II relating to D-Day landings and so on. And we're told that those campaigns were successful, the enemy was deceived, and many lives were saved. So, and at the same time, deception and misinformation can be a very negative tool at the hands of governments, for instance, in regime change and destabilization and in interference with the politics and of other countries. And again, there are many current and recent examples.
We had 3 minutes, so Bill, what is your quick question?
Just to say, the topical thing is the COVID and the vaccination campaign and anti-vaccination campaign. And really, any misinformation can be successful if the target audience accepts it as such at face value. And it makes me very sad to read and to about ordinary people believing the anti-vax arguments and deciding not to have the vaccine. And the only way that perhaps this can be countered is by public education, and that's the job of science.
Okay, thank you. So James, do you have a question? If you do, ask a question.
I do. I just have to reference it just slightly. I'm interested in this gap. So you mentioned, these two poles, sort of true or false, or right and left, or whatever they happen to be. And it's the gap in the middle, which is the most interesting place, because that's the bit where no one wants to stand. And if you do stand there, you get it from both sides. So, Peter, the first question, or near the beginning, spoke about listening. And then Laura has mentioned that as well about making these connections. Alan mentions about this ethos of personal responsibility. What practically can people do? Because we live in, people saying it's a fact, it's science, but then you have people on the other side saying it's alternative fact. So what are the practical things that we can actually be doing?
Okay, so Laura and Alan, in your final 2 minutes, what is that one practical things that anyone here should be doing and preaching?
Alan, go for it.
So I have a colleague who's come up with the concept of PEP, and this applies whether talking to people who have gone down the rabbit holes of QAnon or conspiratorial thinking, or talking to people who we have strong disagreements about political issues or other issues. And it's patience, empathy, and persistence are the qualities. And what you can't do is be dismissive or derisive about the other person's points of view, however tempting that may be. But you need to be patient in talking to them, talking about asking where they get their information, why do they believe certain things, are they open to possibly other sources, maybe somebody in the community, maybe a minister or a teacher or somebody they trust, empathetic with where they're coming from, why they believe what they're believing, and then know you're not going to turn them around in one conversation. I mean, you need to be patient, and whether it's a family member or a friend, it may be many conversations over time where you try to reach that middle ground, and if they are really down that rabbit hole, to try to bring them back to a more reasonable view of that issue of the world.
Okay, Laura, very quick.
I love this answer. I mean, you said it so well, and I'm just going to say empathy and dignity, slow down. Take a moment before you respond. The more we yell at each other, we perpetuate this. And the more we approach each other with dignity and listening, the more likely we are to be able to overcome some of these barriers and depoliticize things that should just be conversations we have, and not make people choose one side or the other.
Well, Alan and Laura, thank you for sharing your insight with us this afternoon. And for those who are working in university or researcher, Knight will be announcing the open call in mid-July. We're looking for research proposal, short-term research proposal that look at disinformation's impact on communities of color. So be on the lookout for that announcement. Back to you, Hallie.
Thanks so much. And thank you to Laura and to Alan for this important conversation. And thank you to Paul for shepherding us through it. Stay tuned for our July 21 virtual program with Alex Wellerstein and Lynn Eden as we discuss Wellerstein's new book, Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for supporting the Bulletin and participating with us this last hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.